Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military, one of the Way to Wow shows. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, with an hour in for Central and Mountain time. Think about that for a second. And our purpose for being here each week is to talk about military doctrine, military history, the leadership skills of great military leaders, and apply them to the business world so that we can improve our own businesses or those that we work with. And I should quickly add, when I say businesses, really any organization. It doesn't have to be a for-profit company. It could be a nonprofit, could be an academic endeavor. In any case, these are lessons that we can use throughout our professional lives in order to accomplish more, work with people better, and in the end, achieve the goals of our organization. So, like any good military discussion, you have to have a PowerPoint. And here is our PowerPoint for today. Right, business lessons for the military. And everything we do, as I've mentioned before, revolves around the three pillars of attainment. In particular, today we're working in the pursuits pillar, finances realm, but we're also dealing with relationships, primarily friends and colleagues, especially since our topic is cultural differences. So we're going to actually wrap up this this larger topic from Marine Corps Warfighting Doctrine on cultural literacy, dealing with cultural differences. Last week, we talked about cultural norms. Excuse me. And if you'd like to see that episode, please go to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@thewaytowow, and you can see that and all of our other previous episodes. So there were 7 cultural norms that we talked about. So I want to wrap up now in talking about cultural patterns. These are the ways that different cultures deal with different topics isn't really the right description, deal with different ways of behaving, I guess is the best way to put it. Okay, and we're going to look at 4 cultural patterns. There are actually more in Marine Corps Warfighting Doctrine. I believe there's 6 or 7 in total. These 4 are the ones that relate most directly to the civilian professional world. And I think these are the ones we want to keep in mind as we deal in sort of cross-cultural or multicultural environments. Now, excuse me, it's obvious if we're going to a foreign country that we're likely to deal with different cultural patterns than our own. Okay, but even here in the United States, we can encounter people who come from a different cultural background, have different cultural patterns than ours, and they may even have been born in the United States, but because they were raised in a sort of cultural enclave, if you will, so the cultural patterns they exhibit will be different than more mainstream American culture. And so whether we're dealing with perhaps someone from another country who's in the United States temporarily, maybe they're working on a project with us, or they've recently come to the country and they're looking to the United States, they're looking to settle here or at least be here for a long period of time, and yet they haven't absorbed American cultural norms, or we're in another country by having a sense of cultural patterns will make our interactions with other people better and more productive. So merely because someone is in this country, that doesn't mean that we should expect them to know how things generally work here in the United States. They may be attempting to learn and understand that, but that doesn't mean that they already do. And so minimally, we want to recognize these and help the people we're working with understand how to navigate different cultural patterns, just as we do the same. Especially as leaders, we need to model the behavior we want the people we're leading to demonstrate as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about each one of these 4 cultural patterns, and we'll talk about some examples, and hopefully this will give you some practical takeaways in terms of dealing with cultural differences. So first of all, attitudes toward conflict. So here in the United States, we tend to be fairly conflict averse. So we don't go looking for conflict in most cases, especially in the workplace. Now, I'm going to focus specifically on the workplace. In other arenas, one could, I think, effectively argue that there are places where Americans specifically try to create conflict, but I'm going to stay up with a workplace focus. So, in the American workplace, we tend to avoid conflict, sometimes to our detriment, so that when there are problems arising, they're overlooked or sort of shunted to the side in an effort to keep things more congenial. So that may not be an effective an effective way of dealing with conflict. Okay. However, once a conflict arises in the workplace, as Americans in general, we tend to deal with it forthrightly. So if conflict is there, it's not unusual for the conflict to be acknowledged and for the 2 parties to sort of deal with it head to head. In some cases, there can be flaring tempers. There can even be yelling, those kind of things, although they're not appropriate for the workplace. Nonetheless, those things can happen in the American workplace. Now, in other cultures, for example, in the Far East, in Far Eastern Asian cultures, so conflict avoidance is an ingrained cultural pattern, to the point that even when there is a conflict and it's been identified that a conflict exists, you won't see the 2 parties go head to head. Okay, it'll be dealt with obliquely, or perhaps through a third party, or in other cases, it can be allowed to simmer and just keep going on, and not, make any progress at resolution. Okay, so it's a very different way of dealing with conflict. So if you're in the workplace dealing with someone who has a different cultural pattern, okay, approaching them in the sort of typical American way may make them not just uncomfortable, but it may, push them out of the company, because they can't deal with that very sort of in your face way of handling conflict. Okay, so if you have to deal with conflict in the workplace, rather than dealing with the conflict first, it would be wiser to talk with the person about how they feel about conflict, how they could be comfortable in dealing with conflict, and you might offer them some options face to face or through a third party mediator, and what would be for them the best way to deal with it. Okay. And if the conflict is between you and somebody, you may decide, if you're concerned about differing cultural patterns between you and the person with whom you have conflict, so then you may decide to have a sort of neutral third party approach the other person and have this discussion with them in order to reduce the chances that either the conflict will come out in sort of, open conflict, egregious conflict, and or that the other person will feel embarrassed, or they'll feel demeaned, or some other negative self-perception that may come from having to deal with conflict in a way they're not used to, or not sort of in a pattern to do. Okay, so attitudes toward conflict, a very important cultural pattern to deal with. And I mentioned this last week. We don't necessarily have to learn the cultural patterns of every culture with which we might come in contact. Rather, we want to recognize that these cultural patterns exist in these situations and deal with them in the context of perhaps there's a different cultural pattern here, rather than the individual is somehow deficient. Okay, so let's look at the next issue of approaches to completing tasks. So again, in the United States, we tend to be very task oriented. So if there's a meeting, people sit down. Typically, the first thing they're talking about is what is the task at hand and how do we get it done? Okay, that's very much part of the cultural patterns in the United States. Other groups put a much higher value on establishing relationships and connections first, okay, before they get to the business of dealing with the task at hand. Okay, so Central and South American cultures oftentimes are much more relationship primacy type cultural patterns than here in United States. Okay, I remember back when I was in the real estate industry, an associate of mine took me to meet a Persian man. He had come to the United States from Iran, and the first thing we did is sit down and have coffee and just talk about things that had nothing to do with business. Okay, that is very common for sort of Middle Eastern and South Asian cultures. So they don't jump right into business. They want to get to know the people that they're dealing with first. Okay, and so to the extent that you find someone in your group who doesn't seem to be, on task all the time, perhaps it's because they feel alienated from the other people in the group, and they haven't quite gotten their relationship bearings set yet. Okay, and they need the time to do that in order to help them build the kind of relationships that then will allow them to focus on task completion. Okay, so again, approaches to completing tasks, the cultural patterns related to that, very different across different groups. Okay, decision-making styles. So here in the US, it's fairly common to make decisions fairly quickly. okay, and fairly decisively. And once a decision is made, to consider that the decision is made, and that's sort of the end of it. And since everybody's agreed to that, so then it's done and we move on. Now, in other cultures, that is not how it necessarily works. So in many cultures, again, Middle Eastern cultures, you see this, the initial decision making isn't hard and fast. It's setting kind of the guidelines through which things eventually will be accomplished. But there's an understanding that these are not hard and fast decisions. They are open to renegotiation. They're open to change. This is not them being dishonest. This is the cultural pattern where, again, relationships have primacy over task completion. And so while decisions may get made, they're not chiseled in stone. They are really just, part of the business of life, so to speak. And especially in the pursuit of relationships, decisions are subject to being changed. Okay, and for Americans, I think this causes a fair degree of I'm not sure what the word is, but discomfort, if you will, because we want to feel like, okay, we've negotiated, we've made a decision, and that's done. And the decision can even be put down on paper, but that doesn't mean that the decision is hard and fast. So I have a group that I'm dealing with, and they're dealing with some folks in the Middle East, and they have a written agreement as to how a particular project is supposed to happen. And partway through, the parties shifted how the whole overall deal was going to come together, and it caused some the American-based people were perturbed by this, and I explained to them that this is not the other side being dishonest. This is the cultural pattern they have in terms of dealing with decision making, and so one has to recognize that. And frankly, the idea that they'll sue on the contract, or what they view as a contract, as opposed to sort of a memorandum of understanding, while maybe that will work, is unlikely to bear fruit, and is more likely to just make the whole project fall apart than it is anything else. So unfortunately, there wasn't a recognition of these differing cultural patterns before they went into the matter. It would have been better for everybody. Neither side really recognized that, I don't think, and neither side spoke about it overtly. And so now, they're dealing with that and working it through, figuring it out. So let's take a quick look at time here. Okay, we're good. All right, so decision-making styles can be different. Now, another example is if you look at Japanese culture. So in Japanese culture, typically the youngest person present in a meeting will be asked to give his thoughts first. Okay, and then the next youngest, and the next youngest, and the next youngest. Okay, and the reason is, in Japanese culture, it's considered rude, at the least, for a younger person to say something that differs with an older person, or not an older person, someone who's older than they are. Okay, so in order to create as much openness as possible. The youngest people go first. They go in order of age, in other words. Now, here in the United States, that seems very strange. So if the oldest person in the room says X, no, for the most part, young people don't feel compelled to say X. They may say, no, I disagree with that. I think blah, 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 blah. Now, of course, that varies with individuals, but there's no cultural norm preventing a young person from disagreeing with someone who's older than he is. Okay, so again, in a meeting like that, one needs to be aware of these. In a meeting where there's cross-cultural patterns, or potentially cross-cultural patterns, one needs to be aware of these issues. If you're the senior person in the room, you might start out. If you're going to give your opinion, you might give your opinion and say, now, I do not intend for any of you to agree or disagree with my opinion. I want to know your candid thoughts about it. If you disagree with me, that's perfectly acceptable. And so, while it may make you uncomfortable or whatever, the expectation in this meeting is everybody will speak their minds freely. Will that work? It depends how deeply imprinted cultural patterns are on any particular individual. But it certainly won't hurt to express what the cultural pattern being followed in the meeting is, and it could potentially relieve someone of what they see as their responsibility to follow the cultural patterns in which they were raised. Okay, finally, attitudes toward personal disclosure. So America, United States, is a very open society. And in fact, you might argue it's too open. People will say things in public today that are kind of like, wow, why would you, why are you telling us about this? This is, none of the public's business. Okay, but this very sort of open expressiveness has become a cultural pattern in much of the United States. Now, I tell you, when I was much younger, the idea of talking about the kind of things in public that people talk about was a non-starter. So that's been a cultural pattern here in the United States that's changed over the last half century or so. Now, merely because here in the United States, people talk so openly about what used to be considered personal matters doesn't mean that the rest of the world has adopted this particular cultural pattern. And one, too, should be careful not to assume cultural stereotypes indeed represent cultural patterns. So I remember talking to, I used to have a French teacher, and we were talking about cultural patterns between the United States and France. And one of the things that came up was how the sort of the attitude toward extramarital relationships and talking about sex in general, that sort of thing, even promiscuity. And the impression I think a lot of Americans have is that the French are very open about extramarital affairs. They're more promiscuous than Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And that is not at all the case. The sort of French, I should say, the sense on the part of Americans that the French are more open sexually has more to do with their literature than it does with the behavior of the typical person in France. And indeed, the French look at Americans as being much more sort of sexually open and promiscuous than they are. And it's hard to say. I mean, all I can say is that there are a lot of misperceptions toward how each country deals with personal disclosure, and one should be careful about assuming that a person from another culture will be as open to personal disclosures as we are here in the United States. So many cultures, especially as you move into cultures where traditional religion, for example, is much more prominent. So in places like South Asia, the Middle East, personal disclosure, that sort of openness is not at all part of their cultural patterns. Rather, they are much more modest, much more discreet in those kinds of things, especially between men and women. Okay, so one needs to be careful about those kinds of things in the workplace to begin with, even here in the United States, where a sort of request for personal disclosure could be viewed as hostile. But even outside of the workplace, in this case, one would need to tread very, very carefully. And so rather than assuming that a person is open to personal disclosures, let's say you're, I don't know, in the lunchroom, and you're sitting with a colleague, and you might ask if you're concerned that there may be a different cultural pattern there, say, would you be interested in telling me about your family? I'm interested to know, and if I've overstepped a boundary, please forgive me. I'm not looking to intrude myself into your personal life. I just am curious to know more about you, or something like that. So give them the ability to essentially decline, knowing that they won't be insulting you by doing so. Okay, so being open and sensitive to other people's cultural patterns, that's really what we want to do, especially in the workplace. And recognizing these 4 areas of particular concern in cultural patterns, and dealing with them in that sensitive way that gives the other person the opportunity to decline to answer, or saves them from embarrassment, will go a long way towards successfully navigating cultural differences. Okay, and I think we're coming up on being out of time. So if you have questions, comments, good, bad, by all means, feel free to contact us. Here's a few places to do it. All of these will be in the show notes. You can always post on social media, especially if it's something you think would interest other people. By all means, put them in social media where we can all take advantage of the comments. I know I've got some viewers in far-flung places, Kenya, I think Pakistan, and especially in this discussion of cultural differences, if you felt comfortable sharing some thoughts on how we might deal more successfully with folks that have the kind of cultural patterns that you have, those would be particularly appreciated. It would help us add to our body of knowledge and success, professional success. So I think we just got our legal stuff. Okay, so taking out of sharing. So that wraps up our set of shows on cultural literacy, cultural patterns, and it's an ever a constant learning process. It never ends, and we are going to make mistakes from time to time, and as long as we're open to understanding we are going to make mistakes, and we're willing to make amends for the mistakes that we make, so we should be able to navigate these issues successfully. And by the same token, if others make those mistakes, make cultural pattern mistakes in dealing with us, we should be open to understanding that's what they are. There wasn't any ill intent, presumably, and in a spirit of learning and mutual growth, deal with them, and then next time, hopefully, such a mistake can be avoided. So I thank you very much for tuning in today. Tomorrow is my show, People Making Money. And I think I planned to do this quite some time ago, but I think the topic is very timely, and that is I'm going to talk about whether it's right for you to buy or rent your home. With interest rates at a high level compared to just a couple of years ago, I think it's more important to look at this question. Look, you may be priced out of the purchase market and may feel bad about renting. Nonetheless, renting may still be the right decision, and you may be better off doing that than trying to really stretch yourself to buy a house. So that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. So please join me. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific will be the next episode, I should say, of Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then 7 days from today, we will be back with a new topic. We're going to be talking about intelligence, not intelligence smartness, but intelligence in terms of gathering information that can help us build our businesses. So that's going to be our next topic going forward for the next several episodes of Business Lessons from the Military at 11 a.m. on Tuesday. And that will wrap things up. So again, thank you very much for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and signing off. Marie, you are my belle. All the best, folks.